The first thing I noticed about her was that she didn't look at the view. Most people who come to Threscale Marginal for the first time stand at the instrument bay window and stare out at the basalt flat for a long minute before they say anything. The flat runs 11 kilometers to the eastern ridge line, and at certain hours early morning just after the primary sets, it turns a color that doesn't have a name in compact standard. Not red, not orange, something older than either word. I've been here 9 years and I still stop for it sometimes, just for a second, before I get back to the work. She walked in, looked at me, and looked at the instrument consoles. That was it, the view didn't register. I remember thinking, she's either done this before or she's carrying something that makes windows irrelevant right now. In 9 years of outer margin survey work, I've learned to tell the difference between people who are indifferent to beauty and people who are too occupied to notice it. She was the second kind. Her name was Keith I. Velorvath. She was listed in the station manifest as an observer attaché from the Velorvath sovereignty, assigned to the Geological Survey Program under the Compact's Reciprocal Research Exchange. Her credentials were in order. Her clearances were current. She had a title I'd never heard, Velsorn Rethorvath, which the glossary in my terminal translated as something close to research-in of the third line, though the translation note flagged the term as carrying weight the compact standard equivalent didn't capture. I didn't ask her about the title. It wasn't my business. What was my business was getting her oriented, setting her up with a workstation and a field kit, and making sure she knew where the emergency pressure equipment was stored in case the ridge walkway vented unexpectedly. The walkway vents about twice a year. It's not dangerous if you know where to stand and what to do. It is very dangerous if you don't. She listened to the safety orientation the way I wish most people would, without the slightly glazed expression that tells me someone is waiting for it to be over. She asked 2 questions. One about the pressure equalization sequence, one about the instrument calibration schedule, and whether she'd have access to the raw telemetry or only the processed outputs. I told her she'd have access to both. She said good. That was the first conversation. She had pale jade copper skin, not the pale that reads as absence, but the pale that reads as something specific to her, like a mineral deposit that only forms under exact conditions. Her hair was close-cropped, dark, with a narrow silver mark at her left temple that I later understood was a sovereignty lineage indicator rather than a decoration. Her eyes were wide and pale silver, which in the instrument bay's overhead lighting made her look like she was perpetually assessing something at a distance, even when she was looking directly at you. There was a thin ring of warm gold at the inner iris edge that I only noticed much later, when the light caught it right. The Velorvath were moderate tier by the old compact classification, clearly non-human, clearly alien, but not in a way that made reading her expressions difficult. She had expressions. She used them carefully. She was 32. I was 46, widower, 9 years into a posting I had originally planned to leave after 3. My wife Ella died in the 6th year. After that, the posting seemed like a reasonable place to be. The basalt flat asks nothing of you except attention. In my experience, that's enough of a demand to keep a person occupied. We worked alongside each other for the first week without much conversation beyond what the work required. She was methodical. She ran her own instrument checks in parallel with mine and didn't duplicate the work. She integrated it, flagging 2 small calibration discrepancies in the east array that I had been monitoring and hadn't yet resolved. She noted them in the shared log without comment and without any signal that she expected me to react to the finding. She had simply found them and recorded them. I added a note to the log acknowledging the observation and crediting it to her. She saw the note on her screen, I could tell from the brief pause in her work, but she said nothing about it. She went back to the telemetry. On the 8th day, I showed her the ridge walkway. The walkway runs along the northern edge of the station exterior, a pressurized glass and frame structure that gives you an unobstructed view of the basalt flat from 20 meters above it. At that elevation, on a clear day, you can read the fault lines in the geology the way you'd read text. The compression ridges, the ancient vent channels, the places where something very large pressed down a very long time ago and left its record in the stone. I use it for orientation when I'm trying to understand a new telemetry pattern. The physical view and the instrument data together give you something neither one gives you alone. She walked the length of the walkway without speaking. At the far end, she stopped and looked out for a long time. I let her look. That was the thing about people who were carrying something. They needed a minute with the view before they could set the thing down long enough to see it. Eventually she said, "The secondary fault line doesn't appear in your Western telemetry because the array is calibrated to the primary substrate frequency." That's right. If you shifted the lower bandwidth threshold by about 4%, you'd pick it up. I tried that 18 months ago. The adjustment introduced noise in the northern readings. She was quiet for a moment. A frequency-selective filter on the northern segment would isolate the noise. I looked at her. That would work. She nodded, as if the conversation had been completed to both our satisfactions, and turned to walk back. I followed her, already thinking through the filter parameters. That was the second conversation. We adjusted the array over the following 2 days. The secondary fault line resolved clearly in the Western telemetry by the end of the week. I added a note to the station log crediting the calibration suggestion. She noticed the credit again, the same brief pause, the same return to work, and said nothing. After the second credit note, she came to my workstation, stood beside my chair, and looked at the screen for a moment. Then she said, "You don't have to keep doing that." I said, "The log is supposed to be accurate." She looked at me. Most coordinators summarize the session observations under their own entries. That's one way to keep a log. She was quiet for a moment, then, "My name in the log." "It's your observation." She looked at the screen for another moment. Then she went back to her workstation. I went back to mine. Neither of us said anything else about it. I started noticing things about her that I didn't intend to notice. She woke before the early shift and ran the preliminary instrument checks before anyone else arrived. She ate at the station table rather than in her quarters, which most visiting researchers avoid. The table is in the communal area, and there's usually some noise and movement through it even in the off hours. She didn't seem bothered by the noise. She seemed, if anything, to seek it out. I came in early more than once and found her already at the table with the day's readings on her screen, eating in the center of the room's low hum rather than at the quieter end near the partition. She had headaches. I only knew because she kept a specific formulation of analgesic on the station table beside her water canister, and she reached for it more often in the first 2 weeks than she did in the weeks that followed. I didn't mention it. It was her business. But I noticed when she stopped reaching for it as often, and I noticed that the timing correlated roughly with how much time she had spent in the shared station spaces versus alone in her quarters. I put it down to adjustment. New postings are hard on the body. The pressure differential at threscale marginal is inside compact standard tolerance, but it's at the edge of that tolerance, and some people take several weeks to equilibrate fully. In the 3rd week, she ate lunch at the station table, and for the first time, asked me something that wasn't about the work. She asked about the station before my posting, who had coordinated it, what the research focus had been. I told her, 2 coordinators before me, both shorter tenures, both focused on the primary substrate mapping rather than the secondary fault system. The station had been more active in their time, more rotating researchers, more exchange postings. I'd quieted it down somewhat, consolidated the data collection, tried to get the array into a state where the readings were actually reliable rather than comprehensive but noisy. She listened carefully. When I finished, she said, You prefer accurate data to abundant data. If the data's wrong, the abundance makes it worse. She nodded slowly. The Velorvath survey program had the same argument internally for about 15 years before the accurate data position won. There are still researchers who disagree. I said, "What did you think?" She looked at me as if the question was unexpected. I was on the accurate data side. I argued for the calibration reforms that were eventually adopted. A pause. I was 24. I was not the most diplomatic advocate. I said, "Did it work?" The dry, almost private sound she made sometimes, the equivalent of a quiet laugh. Eventually, the reforms are in the program now. We ate the rest of lunch in companionable silence. Outside the window, the flat held the midday light without doing anything spectacular. In the fourth week, I showed her how to read the vent pressure indicators on the ridge walkway, the specific combination of readings that meant a vent event was building, distinct from the routine pressure fluctuation that the indicators showed several times a day. If you knew what you were looking for, you had about 12 minutes between the warning pattern and the vent itself. 12 minutes was enough to reach a safe position if you were on the far end of the walkway. It was not enough if you missed the warning. She learned the pattern in one session. She didn't ask me to show her twice. When I tested her on it the following day by pulling up a historical vent event in the station log and asking her to identify the warning onset, she found it within 40 seconds. I told her she'd got it. She said, "The pattern in the last 4 readings before onset is the tell. Everything before that could be ordinary fluctuation." That's right. It's the same principle as the substrate telemetry. You're looking for the last few data points before the system changes state, not the overall trend. I hadn't thought of it that way before. I told her that. She looked mildly surprised that I'd said so. It's obvious when you see it. Most obvious things take a while to see. She looked at the walkway indicators, then she looked at me. The thin gold ring in her iris was catching the light from the instrument panel. "Yes," she said, "they do." We had an actual vent event in the 4th week. A real one, not a historical reconstruction. I was on the walkway's far section, running an exterior sensor check, when the indicators began their warning pattern. I started moving toward the safe position at the near end, and then I saw that Keithai had come out onto the walkway's midsection, which was where she usually went when she needed to see the northwest quadrant of the flat from elevation. She had already identified the pattern. She was already moving. Her pace was deliberate, not panicked. She'd read the indicators correctly, and she knew she had 9 minutes. She reached the safe section 2 minutes ahead of the vent itself, which came up through a fissure in the near ridge face, a long, low sound that you felt in the walkway frame more than heard through the pressure shell. She stood beside me in the safe section and watched the dust disperse across the flat below. After a moment she said, 11 minutes from warning onset. I had a margin of 2. I said, "That's a reasonable margin." She turned to look at me. "Is your usual margin larger?" On a calm day, yes. On a day with unpredictable surface readings, I'd aim for the same as you got. She looked at the fissure. The last of the dust was settling. "I'll aim for 3 minutes in future." "Good practice." She nodded and went back inside to continue her work. I stayed on the walkway for another minute, watching the flat return to stillness, and thought about the fact that she had not said anything about the margin she'd had and how close it wasn't. She had simply assessed it accurately and adjusted her future target. That was the only thing the situation required. Not every person manages that. Some panic, some overconfide. She did neither. She read the situation as it was. Later that week, I came in early and found her at the station table with a Velorvath text open on her secondary screen, not the research database, but something formatted differently. I recognized the formatting as something personal, a private document rather than institutional. She closed it without self-consciousness when I came in, the way you close a letter rather than the way you hide something, and pulled up the shared readings from overnight. I didn't ask what it was. In the work, she was consistent. She never produced a careless annotation. She never filed an interpretation she hadn't checked twice. When she was uncertain about something, she said so, not apologetically, but accurately. I haven't verified this. Here is what I have so far. Here is what I still need. The difference between an uncertain reading and a bad reading is whether you know which one you have. She always knew which one she had. I found myself, without deciding to, ordering my own work differently. Her notation style was more compact than mine without sacrificing precision, and I started borrowing the efficiency. When she flagged something uncertain, she used a specific notation marker that made it easy to find in the log later when more data came in. I started using the same marker. She noticed. I could tell from the momentary pause when she saw it in my entries, but she said nothing about it. The log filled up through those weeks the way a survey log should, incrementally, honestly, with the record of what had actually been found rather than what had been hoped for. In the 5th week, I showed her the observation shelter. The shelter is a small pressurized structure at the top of the eastern ridge, 30 minutes on foot from the station through a marked surface route, longer if the conditions are marginal. It has seating for 4, a viewport that faces west over the entire basalt flat, and a single instrument terminal I use for field calibration when I need to be physically closer to the eastern array. It's also the place I go when I need to think about something difficult, and I want the view to do some of the work. In 9 years, it's done a great deal of work. I brought her up because the western array was showing a pattern I hadn't seen before, and I wanted to read it from the ridge elevation before I filed an interpretation. 2 perspectives are almost always better than one. In survey work, the physical vantage and the instrument data are both true and they're both incomplete, and the truth you need is usually somewhere between them. She sat beside me at the terminal and worked through the pattern methodically. We spent 4 hours up there. She made 2 cups of ground seed concentrate on the shelter's small heating element without asking whether I wanted one. She set mine beside my terminal without comment and went back to the readings. I drank it and kept working. We ate the field rations I'd packed around the 2nd hour. She ate without stopping the analysis, which I recognized as a survey worker habit. You keep the work going while you refuel because if you stop, you sometimes lose the thread of what you were seeing, and the thread is the thing that matters. She had the habit. It's not something you develop outside of real field time. At some point, I'm not sure exactly when, the conversation shifted from the instrument pattern to something else. It was gradual. The way it happens when 2 people have been working together long enough that the boundary between work and the rest of it becomes permeable, without either of them choosing to make it permeable. She asked me about my work before the posting. I told her, structural engineering originally. A transit to survey work after a project in the outer margin lost its funding. Then this station, which had needed a coordinator, and offered a contract long enough that I'd stopped thinking of it as temporary. She listened to all of this without the polite but distant expression that people use when they're waiting for you to finish. She was actually listening. I could tell because when I finished, her first question was about the collapsed funding project and what the substrate conditions had been, what the work had been trying to answer, not about why I'd stayed 9 years, which is what most people ask first. I told her about the project, what it had been trying to do, the problems it had gotten partway toward, the ones I still thought about sometimes when the telemetry showed something reminiscent. She told me that the Velorvath survey program in the Kethsorn corridor had a parallel set of open questions. She didn't volunteer that she'd been the lead researcher on the published comparison study those questions had generated. I found that out later, from the citation list in the Compact's shared research archive. I'm not certain why I started checking the archive. I did, and I found it, and I didn't mention it to her. She asked about Ella somewhere in the 3rd hour. Not by name, she asked whether I had family on the inner systems. I said my wife had died 6 years ago. She was quiet for a moment, and then she said she was sorry in Velorvath first, then in Compact Standard. Not because she thought the first didn't count, because she wanted me to have both. I thanked her. She looked out at the basalt flat. The primary was an hour above the ridge line, and the flat was in its late afternoon register, shifting through colors that don't have names. The colors that don't have names are the ones that happen in transition, between states, between light conditions, between one thing and whatever comes next. They're the best ones. They never last long. I said, it's worth coming up here for this. She said, yes. Then, after a moment, I come up here on my own sometimes. I wasn't sure you knew. I hadn't known how often. Every few days, usually early before the first shift. I thought about that. I've seen the shelter access log show activity at unusual hours. I assumed it was equipment drift, the terminal running diagnostics. She made the small dry sound. No, that's me. You could have said. I wasn't certain I had the right to use it outside the work schedule. I told her she did. The shelter was station infrastructure, and she was station personnel for the duration of her posting. She had access to all station infrastructure on the same terms as any researcher on exchange. She said thank you. We stayed until the primary was an hour from the ridge, then came down the surface route in the low afternoon light. She was quiet on the way back. Not the heavy kind of quiet, the kind that means someone is carrying something, but the lighter kind. The kind that comes after a day when the work went well, and you've looked at something true for long enough that it has settled somewhere useful. In the 6th week, something changed. I can't point to a single moment. It was more like a slow adjustment in the light, the kind of change you only notice by comparing where things are now to where they were 3 weeks ago. She laughed more. Not often. She was not a person who laughed easily, and the ones that happened were quiet, dry, nearly private. But they were there. She started arriving at the station table before me in the mornings, which meant there was a cup of ground seed concentrate waiting when I came in, and the day's preliminary readings already up on the shared screen, annotated in her precise notation with whatever she had noticed overnight. She also slept better. I knew because the station's environmental system logged occupancy patterns for power management, and her quarters showed a more regular cycle in weeks 5 and 6 than in weeks 1 and 2. She wasn't getting up in the night as often. The logs didn't tell me why. They just showed that something had adjusted. The headaches were essentially gone. She hadn't reached for the analgesic in 11 days. I was keeping track, not because it was my business, but because attention, once directed, is hard to stop. You notice what you notice. She spent more time in the communal area. Not performing sociability, that wasn't her register, but she was present in the shared space in a way she hadn't been in the first weeks, working at the station table rather than taking her portable terminal to her quarters, running the afternoon data reviews in the instrument bay rather than on her personal screen. The station wasn't crowded. It was the two of us and the automated systems, and, on alternating weeks, a maintenance technician who came in for the external equipment checks and stayed 2 days. But she oriented toward the occupied space rather than the quiet one, and I noticed that she did, and I noticed that she did it without appearing to notice herself. She also asked more questions. Not work questions, those had always been frequent and precise. Questions about the station's history, about other researchers who had been posted here, about the Outer Margin Survey program generally, and how it had evolved since the Compact's expansion into the Kethsorn systems. She asked about a researcher who had been here in year 6, a young Compact geologist named Rail Tornies, who had been one of the best I'd worked with, and I told her about the fault interpretation Rail had made in the 3rd month that had redirected the program's focus for 2 years afterward. She listened and then said, Torney's published that interpretation in the shared archive. I read it 11 years ago when I was starting the Keth Sorn program. I didn't know where the work had been done. I said, here. She looked at the instrument bay. Yes, she said. Here. There was something in the way she said it, not nostalgia, which wasn't her register, but something like recognition. The kind that comes when you realize a place you've been working in has a history that connects to something you already knew. It makes the place more real. It gives the work a longer shadow than you realized. In the 7th week, she told me. It was early. I'd come up to the observation shelter before the first shift because the Eastern Array had flagged an anomaly at 3:40, and I wanted to read it from the ridge before the primary rose fully and changed the light conditions. She came up about an hour after sunrise, carrying her field kit and the ground seed concentrate, and sat down beside me without preamble and looked at what I had on the terminal screen. She said, "The anomaly is in the secondary substrate transition layer. You won't resolve it at this calibration." I adjusted the calibration. The anomaly resolved into a clear stratification pattern, deep, old, nothing alarming but interesting, worth adding to the fault system record. We worked through the interpretation together for about 40 minutes. Then she put the terminal on standby and sat back and looked out at the flat, and I knew, the same way you know when a seismic pattern is loading before a release, that she was about to say something that wasn't about the work. I put my own screen on standby and waited. She said, "I want to tell you something. I need to ask first whether you're willing to hold it in confidence until I've filed the formal notification with the compact registry." I said I was. She was quiet for a moment, not hesitating, gathering. The way you gather before you say something precisely because the precision matters. She said, "My species has a dependency. That isn't the word we use internally. We have a longer term that doesn't translate well, but dependency is the compact standard approximation." I waited. Velorvath cognitive function operates within a narrow frequency range. Reasoning, long-term planning, emotional regulation, all of it runs through a specific neural oscillation band. In isolation, meaning in environments containing only Velorvath, that band becomes progressively compressed over extended periods, weeks, sometimes months, depending on the individual and the degree of isolation. The compression produces headaches in the early stages. After that, decision-making quality degrades. After that, the effects become more serious. She said it the way you state a measurement, precisely, without inflection, because the precision is the point. I had heard her use that register many times in the work context. It meant she was being exactly as accurate as the information allowed. I said, "What corrects it?" She said, "Proximity to cognitive oscillation patterns outside the Velorvath range." I looked at her. She looked back at me. Human range oscillation patterns are compatible. More than compatible, the interaction is what we call resonant. The Velorvath band and the human range band don't match, but they interact in a way that expands the Velorvath operational window rather than compressing it further. We don't fully understand the mechanism. We've been studying it for 60 years. I said 60 years. The Species Council classified the dependency when we first identified it. The reasoning was that disclosure would compromise Velorvath's standing in compact negotiations. An acknowledged biological dependency on another species it was considered an unacceptable vulnerability. The Council voted to classify it. The research continued, but internally only. Nothing went into the shared archive. Nothing was disclosed to the compact. For 60 years. For 60 years, she paused. I'm aware of how that sounds. I said, "What changed?" She was quiet for a moment, not evasive, but working through something careful. "I've been part of the research program for 11 years. I argued for disclosure in 2 successive Species Council reviews. I was overruled both times. The third review is in 4 months. She paused again. I decided not to wait for the third review. I thought about that. The notification you're going to file, that's not sanctioned by the council. No, it is my decision as a Velsorn Rethorveth, a research envy of the third line. My office carries independent disclosure authority under the terms of the Compact Research Exchange Agreement. The Council's classification overrides many things. It does not override the independent authority of a posted envoy under a formal exchange agreement. I checked this carefully. I believed her. She was exactly the kind of person who would have checked it carefully. I said, "Your headaches?" "Yes." "They were worse in the first 2 weeks." "Yes." "And they improved after." "Yes." A pause. "The improvement began in the 3rd week, roughly." I thought about the station table, the communal area, the noise and movement she had sought out rather than avoided, the observation shelter every few days before the first shift, because the access log had shown me here at that hour. I said, "You came up here early because you'd seen my access times in the log." She looked at me. Something shifted in her expression, not surprise exactly, more like the moment when a calibration resolves and what was unclear becomes legible. "I came up here because the log showed this was where you were in the early morning." "Yes." A pause. "I wasn't planning to tell you that." "But you're telling me now." "I'm telling you now." I sat with that for a moment. Outside, a wind was moving across the flat. I could see it in the way the fine surface dust moved without hearing it through the shelter's pressure shell. A long, slow movement from west to east, like something turning over in its sleep. "The reverse interaction," I said. "You mentioned it briefly. In humans, does it produce the same kind of effect?" She looked at me carefully. "You've been here 9 years." "Yes." The station hosted Velorvath exchange researchers in years 4, 6, and 7. I had not made that connection. I sat with it for a moment, and it settled in the way that a true thing settles, not like a surprise, but like a thing that had been true all along and was now simply named. "The preliminary data on the reverse interaction," she said, "suggests something functionally similar. The mechanism appears symmetrical, though the Velorvath band is narrower, so the effect on humans from Velorvath range exposure is different in character. What your literature describes as ambient cognitive noise, the low-level decision fatigue that builds in isolated human environments, appears to reduce. Focus improves. Pattern recognition appears to extend. We have 11 years of data on this. It is not as extensive as the 60 years on the primary interaction, but the trend is consistent." I thought about the last 9 years, the way the work had gotten cleaner. Problems that would have tangled me up in the 3rd year resolved almost automatically now. I had attributed that to experience, to the accumulation of pattern recognition from doing the same kind of work for a long time. Experience was part of it. But 3 exchange postings, 18 months of combined Velorvath proximity across 9 years, that was also part of it, and I had not known enough to account for it. "The framework you're going to propose," I said. "Reciprocal postings. Formally recognized, voluntary, with a research monitoring component. Not just Velorvath researchers embedded in human staff stations. Human researchers embedded in Velorvath stations as well. Both interactions documented, both benefits acknowledged." She paused. "The Council's objection has always been that disclosure makes us appear vulnerable. My argument has been that mutual benefit is not a vulnerability. It is a foundation." I said, "That's a better argument than they were probably prepared for." The dry, quiet sound again. "I've had 11 years to refine it." We were quiet for a moment. The flat outside was immense and still. At the far end of the 11 kilometers, the eastern ridge caught the early light and held it, long and pale and very clear. I said, "Why tell me specifically? Why not file the notification and let the compact process handle the disclosure?" She was quiet for longer than the question required. When she answered, she spoke slowly, not because she was uncertain of the words, but because the words were the precise ones and she wanted to give them the right amount of space. Because you credited my observations in the station log when you didn't have to. Because when I didn't know whether I had the right to use the shelter, you told me I did, not as a concession, but as a statement of fact. Because when you showed me the ridge walkway on the 8th day, you let me look at the fault lines for as long as I needed to without making it into something it wasn't. She paused. Because when I told you I was sorry about your wife, you thanked me for saying it in both languages, and I understood that you meant the first one. She was looking at me now with the pale silver eyes, and the thin gold ring that I had only noticed weeks ago when the light caught it right. Because if the notification is going to mean something, if the framework is going to be built on something real rather than just the biology, it should begin with a record that includes someone who already embodied what we're trying to describe, without knowing, without being asked. She paused once more. That is you, whether or not you knew it. The wind moved across the flat again. The slow west to east turn, reading the stone the way the stone could be read from up here. 11 kilometers of ancient record laid out in the light. I said, then let's make sure the notation gets it right. She looked at me for a moment. Something in her expression moved, the same way the flat's early color moves, gradual and then suddenly complete, and you realize it's been moving the whole time. She said, yes, let's do that. We stayed in the shelter for another 2 hours. I made more ground seed concentrate. She pulled up the draft notification on her field terminal, and we went through it together, not me editing it, but reading it carefully and asking questions when the compact standard translation seemed to flatten something the Velorvath original was carrying. There were several places where it did. She revised to capture what the translation had lost. The work was slow and precise, and both of us were good at it. One word we couldn't find a compact standard approximation for at all. The Velorvath term for the specific quality of cognitive function in the presence of compatible resonance, not just clear thinking, but what she described as thinking with the full instrument rather than a partial one, like receiving a survey reading through a calibrated array rather than a drifted one. I understood exactly what she meant. I didn't have a word for it in my own language either. We left it in Velorvath in the notification text, with a translation note explaining the approximation problem and what the term was meant to convey. She read the note back to me after she'd written it. I said it was accurate. She saved it. She filed the notification that afternoon through the Compact's secure research channel. The confirmation came back inside 40 minutes, which meant the registry had flagged it for priority review. It would reach the appropriate Compact offices within the day rather than the standard processing queue. I made a note in the station log. Observer attaché Keithai Velorvath had completed a significant formal research disclosure under the Reciprocal Exchange Program. The note was brief. The station log records work. What I was recording was work. That evening we ate at the station table, as we usually did. She talked about the Velorvath survey program in the Kethsorn corridor, the parts she hadn't told me before, the ones that were interesting rather than formally relevant, the substrate anomalies that still didn't have interpretations, the instrument array design that had taken 4 iterations to get right, the postdoctoral researcher who had accidentally identified a critical fault pattern when she dropped her terminal in the field, and the impact knocked the calibration threshold 4% out of alignment, the same 4% we had applied deliberately to the Western array here. I told her about the funding collapse I'd mentioned before, the parts I hadn't told her then, the specific substrate question the project had been working toward, what I still thought might be findable in the data, if anyone ever went back to it with better tools than we had then. She listened the way she always listened, completely. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment, and then she said, The Keth-Zorn program's secondary data set might overlap with that question. I'd need to check the calibration parameters, but the substrate conditions are similar. I said, that would be worth checking. She said, I'll look at it tomorrow. We were at the table until late. The station's environmental system cycled to low-power mode around us, and neither of us moved to adjust it. In the weeks that followed, the compact's response to the notification moved faster than I expected. A formal research committee was convened within the month. SciFi was asked to present the 60-year research history and her recommendations for the exchange framework. She presented from the station, using the secure communications terminal, and I stayed out of the workspace during the session. It was her work to present, not mine to be nearby for. But I could hear, through the partition, the precise and unhurried way she answered the committee's questions. I could hear when the questions got harder, and when she met them with the same steadiness she brought to everything else. I could hear when the committee's tone shifted, the questions becoming less adversarial and more genuinely exploratory, which is the only real sign that a committee has moved from defending its existing framework to considering whether a better one exists. The session ran 4 hours. When she came out of the workspace, she set the terminal on standby and came to the station table and sat down. I put a cup of ground seed concentrate in front of her without asking whether she wanted one. She wrapped both hands around it. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "They want the raw data, all 60 years of it, the classified research archive." I said, "Will the Species Council release it?" "They'll have no choice. The Compact's formal research committee has standing to request the full archive under the exchange agreement's transparency provisions. The Council classified the data under internal sovereignty authority. That authority does not supersede a formal Compact research committee request." A pause. I knew this before I filed the notification. So did the Council. They simply believed I wouldn't do it. I said, "What happens now with the Council?" She looked at the table. The third review was in 4 months. There won't be a third review now. There will be something else, a formal response to the disclosure, a determination about my Velsorn Rethorvath authority, a reckoning with the 60 years of classified research that the committee will now have access to. She paused. "It will be complicated." I said, "Are you all right?" She looked up at me. The question had surprised her. I could tell because she took a moment to decide how to answer it honestly rather than formally. She said, "Yes, I made the decision carefully. The difficult part was before. Now the work is in front of me, and I know how to do that." I nodded. That was a true thing about difficult decisions. The hardest part is usually the period before you make them, when you're still carrying the weight of all the possible futures at once. After, you're only carrying one future, and it's the one you chose, and that's always lighter than all of them together. The committee's preliminary response took 2 weeks. It was cautious and substantively engaged in roughly equal measure, which in my experience with compact bureaucracy is the best realistic outcome. The framework proposal, reciprocal resonance exchange postings, formally recognized, voluntary, with a research monitoring component built in from the beginning, was accepted in principle within 6 weeks of the notification. Implementation would take longer. Implementation always takes longer, but the principle was there, and the principle was the hard part. There was also a response from the Velorvath Species Council, which arrived through formal diplomatic channels 10 days after the committee's preliminary response. SciFi read it at the station table while I was running the morning instrument checks. She read it twice. I didn't ask what it said. When she was finished, she closed the document, made a note on her personal terminal, and came over to the instrument console. She said, "The Council has confirmed that my disclosure authority was valid under the exchange agreement's terms. They are not contesting the notification." A pause. "They are also formally requesting to be included in the committee's framework development process, as contributing partners rather than subjects of inquiry." I said, "That's a different position than classified denial." "Yes," the small dry sound. 60 years of data that will now be shared publicly has a concentrating effect on positions. I said, "Are you surprised?" She considered. "No, the Council has always been protective of Velorvath standing. Participation in the framework gives them standing. Resistance to it at this point costs them standing. The calculus isn't difficult." But they'd have reached this calculus 60 years ago if they'd made the same calculation then. Yes, they would have. She looked at the instrument console. 60 years ago, the calculation included an assumption about how the compact would respond to a disclosed dependency. They assumed it would be used as leverage. I believe the assumption was wrong. The committee's response appears to confirm that. A pause. I'm glad to be right. I would not have filed the notification if I thought I was wrong. I looked at her. You would have filed it anyway. She looked back at me, a long moment, then, yes, I would have. I believed her completely. 2 months after she filed the notification, I received a formal communication from the Compact's Outer Margin Research Office. Threshcale Marginal had been designated as a pilot site for the first operational cohort of the exchange framework. The designation came with additional funding for the instrument array, and a request that the current station coordinator remain in post for the duration of the pilot period. The pilot period was 18 months. I accepted the same afternoon. Keithai's posting was formally extended to cover the pilot period. She noted this in the shared station log with characteristic economy. Posting extended per research framework designation, period of 18 months. All prior exchange terms continue. Then she went back to the Western telemetry, which had shown a new pattern that morning that neither of us had seen before. I sat down beside her and looked at the data. After a moment she said, "I think it's in the substrate transition layer." I looked at the readings. "You might be right. We should read it from the ridge. I'll get the field kit." She was already standing. She had her jacket on before I'd finished the sentence. I don't know if she noticed she'd done that, moved toward the next piece of work before the current one was formally complete, the reflex too established now to require a decision. On the way out through the instrument bay, she stopped at the window. The primary had just cleared the eastern ridge. The basalt flat was in its early morning register, the color that doesn't have a name, the one that only happens in the first 20 minutes after the primary clears the horizon, before the light settles into something that can be described. She looked at it for a long moment. I waited. Then she said, "I understand why you stopped for this." I said, "It took me a while." She said, "Worth it though?" I said, "Yes." We went out through the airlock and up the surface trail toward the ridge, the field kit between us. The flat stretched out to our left in the low light. 11 kilometers of ancient stone, doing what it had been doing long before either of our species arrived to look at it. Neither of us spoke for a while. There wasn't anything that needed to be said. The work was there, waiting, and we were walking toward it, and the morning was very clear. That's how it goes in my experience. The important things don't announce themselves. They don't arrive with ceremony or formal machinery, though the ceremony and the machinery have their place, and I am glad she filed the notification, and glad the committee responded the way it did, and glad the framework is being built. All of that matters. All of that is necessary. But when I think about those months, the calibration discrepancy on the 8th day, the 2 cups of ground seed concentrate in the observation shelter, the word we couldn't find a compact standard approximation for, the sound of her making a note in the station log after I told her she had the right to use the shelter on the same terms as any researcher. I find I'm thinking about something simpler. 2 people paying attention to what was actually there, getting the calibration right, saying the accurate thing rather than the convenient one, coming up to the ridge when the data required it and sometimes when it didn't. That's all it was. The flat is still there. The fault lines are still in the stone, patient and ancient and unfinished, waiting to be read correctly by the right instrument at the right calibration. Every morning the primary clears the ridge and the flat goes through its colors, and the one that doesn't have a name is still the best one, and still doesn't last long. We've stopped trying to name it. It doesn't need a name. It just needs someone to stop for it.